Hey everyone, I'm Bola. This is that Rugby Union show, and it's an absolute pleasure to join you before the long weekend if you do happen to catch this live. What a time to talk about rugby, to reflect on what we've seen so far. It's been quite a season. We're building up to the international season. There's a bunch of schools rugby that will be happening all across the country in those Easter schools festivals. Varsity Cup is finally done, and well done to UCT's Ikeys for winning that one. I think we'll try and catch up with Robbie Flick sometime soon, leading UCT to a win over Marty's. And they've been in 3 finals where they lost, so they'll be very happy with that result. I reckon something that they can build on. And also very interesting that it was Robbie Fleck up against Kabamba Floors in the coaches box as well. So always interesting to see former teammates, former Springboks or professionals go up against each other. It's a very different type of game from the coaching box. This week, a lot to talk about, a lot to think over because the news as always is busy. So I went and got a newsman, and it is an absolute privilege to put on one of my best rugby friends, Oit Simnikiwe Xabanisa, rugby writer and a man who knows all about following the Springboks, following South African rugby press conferences. You've pissed off a couple of coaches as well. Maybe we'll delve into that. uh, so yeah, look, we're not gonna talk about the very hectic ones, but I think it might be interesting for people to know what it's like to be a journo on the Bok beat and on the rugby beat because it's quite a life. But maybe before we start there, Molweni.
Gavin, yo, I must say, she's, I can't believe it's you and me on this because it's, if you, whoever sees this, some people that are going to see this are going to be like, geez, this is a blast from the past, as in both of us at the same place at the same time. And just sitting and going, like, geez, I didn't know these guys are still alive. But, but yeah, no, we still out here. It's been years, and it would help if we didn't dredge up my friendship with some of the Springbok coaches over the years. Yeah, there's some interesting stories there. But yeah, look,
No, they are.
it's good to be talking to you again. It's it's been a while. Yeah, it's always nice to just, but it's nice to see a familiar face for a change. I go to press boxes and you got all these youngsters, and I'm like, who are these people? Of course, they're probably saying the
Guys.
same thing about me, so it's fair enough. Yeah.
Well, this is a good time to remind all of you watching to drop kick that like button, give us a subscribe, share as far and wide as you possibly can, hit the bell. And yeah, we get to talk rugby. If you do have questions, just post them and we'll certainly delve into them. But uh, I think everybody I've met on the rugby beat has got an interesting backstory. Um, None of us were ever going to or set up to become professional rugby players. And what was that thing I heard when I first started reporting? Is if you can't play coach, if you can't coach report, does that adage still work? Is that the truth?
Yeah, look, I was at that school. I was never big enough. I was never gonna play. I was a cross country boy, actually quite decent at that. And then
And
obviously
we
when
should
I
say
when I find
you're talking about Dale.
the what?
You're talking about Dale.
Yeah, so even though I was at Dale, which was a rugby mad school, I remember when I first got there, it was actually like a ridiculous story. So when I got there, I think we had our centenary year, and we had all these schools come to play, and so they got all the new boys. This is the old days when the kickers kicked from sand, like Andre Pretorius, and so
Yeah.
they made me a sand boy, but obviously. Someone neglected to tell me, the rules, like, or the laws, how it works. Like,
Yeah.
why would I come onto the pitch, with the bucket of sand? I asked the teacher. He basically showed me like the penalty signal. Like whenever they do this, the ref does this, you must just run on and basically make sure that you brought the sand on. Of course, the first couple of times it worked because it was within kicking range, and then at some stage,
Yeah.
like one of the teams, had a penalty in their own 22, and I just like bombed on with the sand. It's like, dude, he's not gonna kick it that far. and you had all these people just laughing. So that was my introduction to, to rugby. And then, believe it or not, I don't know how many years later, there I was actually writing it. I remember walking into a press box and guys looking at me. They'd never seen anything like me because, I was skinny, had these dreadlocks and glasses. And these guys are like, well, what's just happened here? And, they basically were laughing. And, like I probably at the time looked like an extra from the movie Cool Runnings. And if I'm probably being honest, I probably wrote the game a bit like an extra from Cool Runnings as well. So like, they're probably well within their rights to laugh at me. But as you go along, you learn. And over 2 decades later, here I am, which is just, I can't believe I'm still around because I thought by now I would have moved on to other things. But yeah, that's how it works. Look at Beats working.
Yeah, yeah. No, this is how this game works. It sucks you in and it chews you up, but it doesn't necessarily spit you out, which is yeah, a difficult thing at times. But I think one of the things that people don't necessarily know about journalists and rugby writers, reporters, is just how much rugby you have to go through. What would you say, and maybe not now, because I would venture that now you're probably writing fewer rugby stories and maybe branching out into other avenues as well. And I know you're a big cricket fan, and maybe we'll touch on it. Um, how much rugby would you have to go through as a young guy on the rugby beat that you solely, focusing on? What do the editors expect from you?
Put it this way, if you remember the old days of Super Rugby, where you'd have to wake up for, I don't know, a day game in New Zealand, which is what, probably like 6 a.m. in the morning, and
Yeah,
then
so you're up at
work your way all the way up to an Argentina game. One of those one of those Pumas games you had to watch starting at 11. And, like that's like back to back rugby the whole day because you've gone from New Zealand, moved on to Australia, moved on to South Africa, and then moved on to Argentina. And that's your typical day. You choose to watch that. Most people choose to watch that, and the missus knows that okay, I don't talk to the soak for the rest of for the rest of the day. But as a rugby writer, you kind of expected to go through all of that so that you can pick up whatever little bits and pieces that you need to talk about the next week. So it's quite labor intensive. I know a lot of people, think it's not real work, which is fair enough. But the checks are real, they don't bounce. And obviously making friends along the way as well, which yeah, I'm in one of those situations where, one of the organizations basically doesn't invite me when it has a function because I wrote something to offend someone somewhere along the line. So that's just how it works. Yeah, that's pretty much a typical week. The rest of the week, it's in waiting for the main thing, which is, the game at the weekend. But actually, it's quite labor intensive because you're making phone calls throughout the week and you're writing stories, hopefully with enough detail, with enough context, and hopefully stuff that people don't know, as opposed to it's like, well, why should I be reading this? I saw it on Twitter, I saw it on, on wherever. So that's kind of like a typical sort of week. You get on with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing that I've always found amazing with you guys, because from a TV perspective, like I used to do, it was a matter of very, I mean, I don't consider myself a real journalist. A lot of people don't know this. It was very straightforward. It was very cut and dry. It was, here's the team, those are the dates, here are the fixtures. And then, if I'm working in the studio on a Saturday, I've got experts around me that I ask questions. I don't really give an opinion, but you guys had to always come up with an angle. And that always fascinated me, how we're watching the same game and I get fixated on one or two things. Maybe it's the referee, maybe it's a call, maybe it's a tactic, which is generally going to be what people, I think, who watch like fans tend to look at. You look at the big calls. And I'm very fascinated at how you try and find the not so obvious. But I think that also comes with time, comes with knowledge. It comes with knowing the individuals as well. Like, I think um, from me looking in, that seemed to be quite a challenge. Or is that something that you just got used to?
You get used to it. I mean, at first you don't quite know what to write. I remember my very first match report. I was a youngster. It was a Super Rugby game. I'd never written a rugby game, period. So it's like most guys go through schools and then they do a bit of varsity cup, a bit of club rugby. I'd never done any of
Yeah.
those. My first rugby match that I covered was Super Rugby. And the next one was a Springbok game against the All Blacks. So, like, life was coming at me pretty fast there. So obviously what that means is you just don't have enough experience. You don't quite know what you're doing, but you're going to learn on the job. So what I think I distinctly remember my very first one. I wrote this match report, and it was quite rough because it feels like it's getting away from you because you got to file almost immediately after the ref blows the final whistle. And so back in the days, you used to be able to call on a landline to the office and ask, how did it go and stuff like that. And I called this guy whose job it was to kind of like receive the copy. And I said to him, "Well, how did the match report go?" And he says, "I don't know, Sim. You spelled your own name wrong." So because it was a white guy, I was like, you know what? He cannot possibly know how to write my name. And I went and had a look, thinking, "No, man, it's just some white guy, being difficult." I had a look. Bob, I'd spelled my own name wrong. That's how nervous I was. So that's kind of like that's the parameters within which you operate as the journal at those things. But you quickly have to then obviously find a way to match reporting is a very difficult thing. I always say a good match report is one that kind of like resonates with the guy reading it, in that he kind of looks at it and thinks, oh, those are a lot of the things I thought about too. And therefore it becomes good as a result of that. But to be able to point all those things out, there's a part of you that needs to, there are guys that like to see a bit of nice writing. You've got to be a good writer, and there are guys that need to see that you've got a bit of knowledge, and you've got to display a bit of knowledge. And there are guys that need their stat. You got to display stats. And so there's a whole lot of things that you try to cram into, say, 600, 800 words, and it doesn't always quite work out as you think it should or as you think it can. And it's actually gotten worse with the advent of how much analysis goes into a typical game by, say, Supersport or whatever. Or like if you look at if you look at social media, and the fact that there are so many analysts now on social media, not necessarily people who are going to be on mainstream broadcasting, but guys that are there, and these guys, say guys like Squidge, guys who just kind of like break it down almost totally differently. They see it totally differently to how you see it. So you've got to your job is to kind of like score highly on a lot of those little boxes. And if you score highly on most weekends, then you're pretty decent at it. You're never going to be great because, I mean, I don't know how many times I look at sort of like my story on in online, and then you see the comments. Usually the first comment is always some snarky shit about some guy going on about, yeah, but this guy, geez, what does he know? And you kind of live through that because that's just how it works. So it's actually quite a tricky thing to try and put together. Um, and like you say, you can only get that together by getting more and more experience. You get used to it because it takes out the nerves, and you know what to look for as a result.
Yeah, yeah, no, that experience goes a long way. And you mentioned up front, and we're not really going to delve into the coaches' stories. I think we'll have time for that as we continue to have this conversation. Uh, but I know that it becomes tricky when you're not necessarily writing about the rugby. This is South Africa. The politics is always going to be a big part of what it is you have to write, reflect on. And I think, to my mind, that must certainly feel as though it carries a heavier burden. And I'm looking at the current headlines and the big news of the week as, well, South Africa might never host a World Cup again. And the only people you can get comment on are the people who actually run the game. Whether it's World Rugby, whether it's SA Rugby as president or whatever the case is. Um, But it's quite a headline, and I understand what they're saying. Can you break it down for me? Because people are starting to panic about this. I honestly feel like I'll never get to see another World Cup on South African soil in my lifetime. I thought 2023 was our best chance, and we had a very good bid. And things happened in the background. I mean, let's not lie about it. There was certainly wheeling and dealing that went on, but now it's become a pure money related issue. Government has to put up these massive guarantees, and in a country that's struggling, I don't see that change. What do you make of this latest news that we might never get to see the World Cup in SA?
Look, it's sad because, when you look at the pedigree of South Africa in World Cups alone, it's the one country which has now won the most World Cups, even more than, the team that everyone thinks of when they think rugby, which is obviously New Zealand. There should be some kind of give from the game in terms of, you know what, these guys have done an awful lot. I know that when South Africa wins a World Cup, it's not always a happy occasion for the rest of the free world, as we've seen, with the snarky comments. And, I think in 2019, the big thing was, oh, the guys must have been juiced up. In 2020, 2023, the big talking point again was, the bomb squad or the nuke squad if you go 7-1 split. So there's always something to carp. There's always been something for the rest of the world to carp about, because when I look at South Africa or the Springboks, they kind of like the Germany of rugby. If you were to equate them to a football team, it's, everyone kind of like accepts that you are efficient and you are very good, but they can't take to you like they would, say like, Brazil or maybe even the French or Argentina, the more sort of supposedly exciting teams. So there's always like a bit of carping every time South Africa does, but it's inescapable that the Springboks have done an awful lot for World Rugby or the Rugby World Cup. And therefore, you would have expected, some kind of recognition for that. It hasn't happened. And, World Rugby had a wonderful opportunity to do it when the Boks were, had won their third, after the Boks had won their third World Cup in 2023 to bring it down here. The bid, if I'm not, if I'm not mistaken, the phrasing of the bid was that it was the preferred one, but they made a different decision because they somehow felt that they were, they were gonna make more money, I think, with the French. As it's turned out, I think I found out like literally about a week or two ago that the French World Cup lost money. So, go figure. And obviously we were also the team that knocked the French out of their own World Cup in the quarterfinals. So a bit of karma for you there. I understand what they're saying in that the thing about World Rugby is they need to make almost all their money in this one tournament for the next cycle so that they can obviously, you know, distribute that money to all their constituents. And so they need to make as much money as they possibly can. But, you have to think about the game itself. Even if you took the game to New Zealand, I'm not sure you would get the kind of money that you think you would get. So would you be comfortable as World Rugby if your two top exponents of your game, cannot actually have a hope in hell of hosting, a your tournament, your sort of your big thing. And that's kind of like the big worry for me, that we're sitting in a space where it's kind of like, oh well, sorry, everyone just shrugs their shoulders and they move on. In terms of what we could do in South Africa, I look at the fact that we're talking about an F1 race at the moment,
Yeah.
trying to get an F1 race, and we seem to have no issues with trying to raise like 100 million for what would effectively be, one weekend of, of the year. and kind of like do quibble about the fact that rugby could bring its World Cup here. Again, I understand F1 is massively bigger than in terms of the audience it reaches. It's probably massively bigger than the Rugby World Cup. But I think if we still sort of engaging sort of other vanity projects like F1 or trying to bring the UFC to South Africa,
Yeah.
then the bread and butter sport of this country, which rugby is, or which rugby has become, especially over the last two World Cups. Let me not dis football and cricket in the process as well. But the sport that has become the bread and butter sport for South Africa, surely has to get be met halfway in terms of trying to have this thing here, because we kind of own it at some weird level.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you with this hunt for a Formula One race in South Africa. I understand the attraction because it is a global sport, but I think we've got more chances of creating another Siya Kolisi than we do another Max Verstappen. Um, in South Africa, you touched on it right in the beginning. I think people also maybe underestimate the type of relationship South Africa has with the rest of the rugby world. It is complicated. And it's not complicated now. It's been complicated, politically speaking, since South Africa was banned from international rugby. I still remember my last trip to New Zealand, and some guy walked into our hotel at 1 in the morning. I won't tell you where I was coming from, but it was close to Courtney Place. But this guy walks into the hotel at 1 in the morning. I'm walking with another South African, his sister fan. He's traveled to go and support the Boks overseas. And this New Zealander keeps going on about, oh, you yappies, you yappies this, you yappies that. And I was now stuck between these two guys trying to mediate and like calm the Kiwi down and also try and get the South African to understand why it's such an emotive subject for the Kiwi, because I think we underestimate just how much of an impact the politics of South Africa had. And I mean, people still talk about that 1981 tour. Um, and so much of what New Zealand is about was formed or informed by what they got involved in then. So there's this love-hate relationship. There's a massive respect, but I still think there's underlying issues of past historical hate and stuff that we haven't grappled with and we don't necessarily understand either. And then there's the home unions. You go to Europe, and I just think that they consider themselves the base of power of the world game. And then you've got the French who are, ever trying, always the maidens, never win the World Cup. Um, so we're not really popular in these separate spaces. We might be respected, but the popularity, I think, is a thing. And the way it plays out now, when you look at social media, it's evident. You can absolutely see that the divide is not just about the rugby, man. It's not just about the fact that you lost and we won, or we won and you lost. There's something deeper there. That's always fascinated me.
It is. It is the politics. I mean, you say the relationship is complicated. It's positively toxic. It's not a great relationship because it's one of those things you look at quite weirdly. On the one hand, you think, you know what, I can't stand for this bullshit. It's not cool that we have to, that we're winning and we're not getting the accolades that come with winning. You see it often with with the World Rugby Awards at the end of the year. It's like you win a World Cup and all these other players are basically the best players in the world. Oh, that's
In the
nice.
world.
But I don't see them sitting with the World Cup, in their midst. There is
Mm.
sort of that resentment on our side from the grudging respect that the rest of the free world gives us. By the same token, um, you probably look at it as a compliment that when you win like that, you then become the team that everyone likes to see losing. I'll take
Sure.
you. I'll take you to yesterday. A lot of people were pretty happy that Real Madrid lost because, well, they've only won 15 Champions League. Just so
Streets,
it's
yeah.
like after a while, people do want to see a new winner, and we do have to turn it around into a compliment how people feel about us. But by the same token, we've kind of earned it because of the way we play rugby. We bully other teams because it's for us. I mean, if you listen to Rassie, it talks about, if you see videos behind the scenes, he talks an awful lot about effing them up physically, the opposition. That is, it's almost like that's a viable game plan as opposed to how are we going to beat these guys? It's like, oh no, just beat them up physically. And after whatever shakes up afterwards, we score the points, and or Shetland can run and score the points, and we see how that works. So we kind of seen as the big bullies of rugby, of world rugby. And obviously our politics from the time we were excluded from playing rugby for a very good reason. So you look at it and you think, well, it makes sense that our politics don't tally up with everyone. But New Zealanders kind of like getting on their high horse also doesn't quite tally up, because you could quite easily talk about 1986, the Cavaliers tour, where they basically sent their test side, which was sanctions busting. People like to
Yes.
forget those things as if they didn't do anything. Australians
Mm,
and the way they've treated, Aborigines throughout their state. So no one can actually, Europe is built entirely on colonization, which, doesn't come without its fair sort of, dollop of racism, if you know what I mean. So no one's hands are clean. So no one should actually, kind of like walk around getting on their soapbox and trying to tell everybody else how they should be doing it. What we should appreciate, though, is how competitive World Rugby is at the moment. If you take the
yeah.
top 6 teams or so and you throw them in together in a competition, chances are, if you have, competitions over, well, so they would play what, 3 times each or whatever, chances are each week you'd get different results. And that's what you
Yeah.
want from a global game. Instead of kind of like centering on, do you like the Irish or not? Have the Irish become arrogant now that they win matches? Or, do you focus on, the French being French really? That none of that stuff matters. What really matters is we have a very healthy game, and the whole point should be to try and share it. I don't think rugby is one of those. I know rugby would love to grow the game. They talk about going to the US. That rugby's been to Japan already. They
Yeah.
trying to grow it in the way football has grown. I don't think rugby will ever grow in that sense. There's nothing wrong with getting a better US team, getting a better Japanese side, but I don't think rugby will ever grow that. I think rugby's growth is actually in the women's game when they do it
Yeah.
properly and everybody does it properly. So essentially, what rugby has to do, it has to make sure that it holds on to what it has by making sure that it's putting through quality, and it's kind of like staying true to some of its better traditions, because tradition sometimes is just an excuse to stick to doing things the old way. And so I think that's where rugby can kind of like interrogate itself better almost. So I think we shouldn't try too hard to kind of like throw it too much, because it's the way things, the areas you're going to take it into. Sure, maybe some of those places can afford to host a World Cup, but do they have a team that can stay until the knockout stages? Usually, chances are it's not going to happen. So you also don't want that, because suddenly the competition is, suddenly the competition has lost its allure for the locals, because the hosts haven't made the quarterfinals. And so I think that's kind of like where rugby should be thinking, and slowly kind of like bringing the countries that are knocking on the door louder, like your Georgias and your
Mm.
Portugal sometimes, and she's even Spain these days.
Spain. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you're so right, because the Americans, I think, are a good case for what you're saying. If they'd gotten to a Rugby World Cup and made the quarterfinals, then I think the game would grow. But the opportunity they have to reach the quarterfinals is zero almost. It's very min chance that they're going to get enough competition in between the World Cup years, that they're going to have enough quality players as well. Which brings me to my next point, and maybe while I'm looking at the comments, and thanks Mursa Bokbas for your messages. The first one was to I suppose say that the government must stop stealing money, and we shouldn't be victims. So that's to do with losing the World Cup. The second says this is the same with my team, the Stormers. He says we won URC 2022. Coach says he wants to build a dynasty. What is he doing nowadays? He sells all our best players, and then it ends with a not so nice sentence at the end. And I'm using this as a conduit to saying we are the Ajax of World Rugby. South Africa is the nursery, it's the breeding ground, and we export players. One of our greatest exports is not just gold and diamonds, but rugby players. And I wonder how much we should push back on that. I understand you don't want to see CJ Stander play for an island team that's going to beat the Boks. I don't want to see it. But, there's a lot of rugby players in this little country. We can only field so many on any given day. You want to give guys the opportunity.
23.
You want the US to be stronger, to go back to that entire point. Do you think that we should fight this movement of players, or should we actually just let that be the conduit for growth?
I'll start by answering the Stormers question.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. You
the,
called him a
the,
little box, just for the record.
okay. I I I spoke with Franco Smith this week for like a couple of stories that I'm doing, and obviously if you remember, Franco's Glasgow Warriors won the URC last season
You'll see.
at Loftus of all places, of course.
Yeah.
The One of the things that came through was that he basically said, winning those titles comes with its own challenges, and that challenge is suddenly the value of your players has increased to much more than it was before they won. And what happens next is, because they evaluated more, somebody comes and offers them what they are supposedly worth, which yes, they are worth, of course. And then what happens is you've got a choice. Are you going to grow your budget? Are you now suddenly going to grow your operating budget to cover those players not leaving? Or are you going to let those players go because, well, there's nothing else you can do? So that's essentially what happened with the Stormers as well. And then, the vagaries of playing in two competitions, the injuries, whatnot. It's all been said by the coach. But what I'm saying is it's not happening in isolation. There are good reasons why
Yeah.
it happens that way. And those reasons are very basic. Um, you know, it's money. Um, Even winning doesn't, when you're not winning, you think, okay, I need more money to be competitive. Actually, when you win too, it actually costs you because you're going to pay more, which now brings me to the other question you asked, which is, about letting players go play overseas. That's essentially what's happened with the Boks as well. They've won 2 back-to-back World Cups, which basically means they are top 1% players in the world in terms of value. And now, if you Saru, who don't have an equity partner that's going to inject, I don't know, 3-4 billion into the ecosystem, um, how do you keep those? How do you keep those players interested? You're not going to be able to pay. A lot of these guys are going. A lot of these World Cup guys are going for 18, 20 million overseas. How do you pay 20 million when your salary cap is about 90 million? How are you paying 20 million off that, which is literally more than a fifth to one player? And you're supposed to have, say, a squad of about 45 to 50. So, that alone doesn't make sense. You're not going to be able to do that. So Rassie came up with that problem, with that solution where he let the big players be bought by the French teams, the Japanese teams, and the teams in the UK or Ireland. He let that happen because they could get paid what they were worth, and Saru could then focus on the guys that do stay. The guys that do stay, they get player of national interest increments or puts terms. They can't just make it. They're quite cushy. But you don't look at the situation as, you don't look at the situation and go, oh, well, we're just going to try and match it, because you can't match it. You have to let those guys go. But the positive from that is not only do those guys go, they get paid what they're worth, what they're also doing in all those countries. One of the great advantages of the Boks at the 2023 World Cup was, if they played against Japan, they had guys who had intel on Japanese players and Japanese rugby. If they played against France, they had players who have IP on those guys too. If they play against England, same thing. And so you've sent out your sort of spies, as it were. And while they sort of earning the money they need, they're also kind of like learning for you on your behalf. And then what happens in the domestic game, all your under 20s, your promising under 20s, they kind of get shoved into the URC, which is franchise rugby, a little earlier than they probably should. But what that means in English is that they learn a bit quicker as well, which then means your conveyor belt or your quality of younger player. If you look at a Kanan Moody winning the World Cup at what, 20, your
Yeah.
younger player is sort of emerging more fully formed as a result of the pressures on the game to sort of like go look to the next guy, because, well, the guy that's that's between sort of like 21 and 27 has taken a big contract overseas, because, well, he's a big Springbok, big World Cup winning Springbok. So it's, of course, it means you don't have your best players in your own country at all times. But what it does mean is, by and large, everyone is mostly getting what they want. And as a result, your game is stronger than it probably would be as a result. But by the same token, will you ever win a Champions Cup or a challenge? Well, the Challenge Cup has been won by the Sharks, so maybe I shouldn't talk. Will you ever win? Yeah, will you ever win a Champions Cup? Chances are you probably won't, because you just don't have that depth. And when we talk depth, we're not talking about you don't have the talent. You just don't have the same level of experience and ability. You may have the same level of ability, but it's a much younger player who needs another 2 to 3 years to be able to make it. And the real issue is, if you get close by winning a URC, guess what? The same people from France, Japan, England come through again. Take those guys, and you've got to start all over again clean.
Yeah, that I think answers Mursa Bokbas's point about the Stormers. They are going to fight all of the South African teams to keep their best players. And obviously, I think SA Rugby, I think Rassie will make, as you say, provision to try and keep the bulk, to try and keep the very talented. But it's so weird to go through this conversation now, because I mean, when I started out just reporting rugby, it was the whole Percy Montgomery going to Wales and reinventing himself and coming back the short run up for that kick, and he was absolutely phenomenal. I think BJ Botha as well went overseas, and all of a sudden we could see from South Africa that, geez, this guy is a world-class tight end prop. Right? He's actually got something. Whereas I think when he stayed here, we're not really measuring him against the best or the rest of the best. And I also remember speaking to Osturant many years ago, and he was telling me how he so didn't want to take up a contract in France because he didn't want to leave the Plus. It was completely different back then. He didn't want to leave the Plus. They were offering him big money. They were throwing buckets of money at him, and he's like, "Yeah, I will play. I will, I will be Plus play." So that's, to me, very, very interesting how much things have changed. But I don't think we should fight to keep everybody under the same umbrella. What's interesting now is I see the Aussies are having an issue that we'd seen in South Africa with the French teams starting to hunt young rugby players. And when I say young, I mean under the age of 18. This is where they're looking now. And I see now they've trained their eye on Australia, and Australia is already struggling, much like Wales. They don't have a lot of rugby union talent to go around. They've got a lot of athletic talent, but rugby union has fallen down the pecking order. Probably, what, sixth biggest sport at the moment in Australia, maybe even smaller.
Look, it's happened to South Africa as well. If you think back, I can't remember which year it was. We had a year where Kate Voliter, Jan Hendrik Wessels, it might have been George Cronje, and a whole host of young sort of South African players were scouted around the Craven Week, and then they announced that they were going to go straight to France. I think it was Montpellier. They were going to go to France immediately after that, and they weren't chosen for the SA schools for the SA schools team because the coaches are like, well, guys, if you're not going to be in South Africa, then there's no point picking you. And as it turned out, the guys actually came back because they too, like us, liked it better, to be at home in the class. And as a result, they came back, which was cool, no problem. So it has happened everywhere. Australia are now getting it because I think for them, the weakness of their rugby, for want of a better phrase, has basically made it, has made it easier for to target them and to just basically turn up and make sure that you can take whoever you can, because yes, like you said, they've got athletic talent but they haven't got strong rugby. So if you've got a talented rugby athlete who wants to go all the way, you can actually convince him that he can do that with France, and you're not lying because he's looking at the French national team and thinking,
Yeah.
"She's they good." And
They are good.
and so I can understand how it works. And it happened with us, but I just think with us and maybe New Zealand, we could always withstand it simply due to the sheer numbers that we produced, off the conveyor belt. But there are countries that just cannot withstand that simply because, well, they don't have as much in their cupboard, or maybe their game doesn't have as much of a foothold in the rest of the free world as say South Africa, New Zealand, England, and France do.
I welcome the questions. I see time is flying. It always does when you're having fun. But Njabulo, thanks very much for the question. And he asks, are the Bulls doing enough on transformation? The transformation issue is question is one that will never, well, not that it will never go away, but it's certainly here to stay. At least we're not in the same boat as cricket, because those guys, holy hell, they've got a lot to get through. And I suppose, yeah, South African rugby is strange because at the very top, you can see the fruits of transformation, but there are patches underneath where you can see that a lot still needs to be done. And I understand why you're asking, Jabs, but I am also thinking that it's a little bit more complicated than just the Bulls, because when you say just the Bulls, are you talking about the Bulls franchise team that plays URC, the Currie Cup team? Are you talking about the coaching structure? Because when I look at it, that's where I think more transformation could happen. Am I talking about the women's team? Because that's almost a wholly transformed team. So there are pockets within the union structure that probably need more attention than the rest. What's your take, Sim?
Well, transformation. I've
Hey, that's where we're... Yeah.
I've re-
Hey,
I've
Babestu,
wrestled with this for what, a good 25 years. I've wrestled with this for a good 25 years. I've got an 11-year-old who
Yeah.
thankfully is awful at sport. Bless him. He's a wonderful guy and he's a really smart guy, but sport's not going to be his thing. And if he had been, a sports guy and into rugby like his dad was, and maybe actually good, I would be sitting, and worried. And this is like 25 years after I first started, writing about, about the game, that, he might not get a fair shake simply because he's a little black boy. And that's a problem for rugby. People talk about the Bulls having a transformation problem. Yes, of course they do.
I watch the Bulls and it always confuses me. They seem to have this weird sort of philosophy that I don't know if it's Jake's philosophy or whose philosophy it is. They seem to have this philosophy that if you have a pack of an all white pack,
Mm.
and basically, you know, an all black back three, then you're covered, in terms of your, in terms of your
We
transformation
did
needs
that
or
shit
whatever
in
it
the
is.
90s.
That's
Right? We
insane.
did that shit back in school.
That's like taking us back to the year 2000. When
Mm.
if you got your two black wingers, you were good to go. And you look at the Lions, and the Bulls actually field more black players in their match day 23s than the Lions do. And the Lions, for some weird reason, fly under the radar. Lions tend to field about 4 of the 23, which is insane in 2025. But by the same
Yeah.
token, you've also got to look at it and be like, okay, what is transformation for us? Is it a numbers thing or is it an
Yeah.
access thing? If you look at the box, I remember some people were complaining in 2023 saying, yeah, but Rassie sold us dreams because he said there would be X amount of black players in the box squad by that World. And he hadn't quite gotten around to that number. I don't quite look at it like that. I look at it as if Makazole Mapimpi, Lucanio can go all the way from where they are and be able to play for the Springboks. If it's possible for someone like that to go all the way and play for the Boks, then the Boks are transformed simply because it's an access thing. I think that the transformation is blockages, which basically means people can't see people like them and aspire to people, to be like people like them. And then B, they sit there with these man-made barriers that they can't get over. So what I'm saying is if a guy from Geelong in the Eastern Cape can go all the way to the box, then it means the Boks are transformed. If a guy all the way from Sweden with Sia's background can not only go all the way to the box, but can go all the way to lead the Boks to 2 World Cup victories, then that's transformation. So I think we do need to have a shift in how we look at what constitutes transformation. But by the same token, I'm also cognizant of the fact that if you don't enforce those numbers, we'll get to a stage where guys are like, oh, there's no need for numbers. Oh, well, in that case, then we don't have to
Yeah.
follow the numbers. So it's the balancing act that people do need to kind of like constantly review. But my take on what constitutes transformation is that if anyone from anywhere and from any corner in this country, even some white school from a small sort of a really small farm town in the far-flung sort of extremities instead of a great college. If that guy can make it all the way to the box, then the box are transformed. But it's a tough thing to sort of enforce because actually the important thing for me after that is, well, where's the next guy from Geelong? If Magazole is the poster child for what a child from Geelong can do, you then need to say, okay, but what are we doing in Geelong to make sure that the pathway is more solid than Magazole's? It doesn't take Magazole's sort of determination to have to overcome all these obstacles. It's actually a bit smoother from the next guy. Unfortunately, that I haven't seen yet. But yeah, transformation in South Africa has been a little top down simply because Rassie does believe in the black players more than a lot of the franchise coaches do. When I say a lot of them, I mean that some of them do believe in transformation. I think it doesn't matter whether you like the Stormers or not, they believe in transformation. Again, it doesn't matter whether you like the Sharks or not, they believe in transformation. But then their transformation guys are back-to-back World Cup winning Boks. So maybe that was a no-brainer for, on their side. So there's a lot to look at, but you can't pan everyone, with the same blanket. And you mentioned the most important thing. How do you make it easier for these guys to make it into these teams?
Of course, it's by having a coach that looks like them, a coach that knows that they're capable of, of playing at that level because the coach is suddenly coaching at that level. One of the things I used to say about rugby coaches, rugby coaches tend to be white and middle aged. And what happens is those guys, when they look at players, if they're looking at two players, one is a black guy and one's the white guy. That HR laws say that you go with the black guy. They go with the white guy, and there are reasons for that. And they're not always racist, by the way. The easier ones, the one I will give the benefit of doubt to are said coach has to win from the offset. But now he's more familiar with how to press the buttons off the white player to get the best out of him, and probably less so with the black player. And it's no excuse. With the black player, he probably has to find where the buttons are and then press the right ones to get a tune out of him. And so I think a lot of the decisions have been made along those lines where it's like, it'll be easier for me. I'll hit the road, I'll hit the ground running this way if I just pick this guy, which then perpetuates the same thing over and over and over again. It makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy that, oh yeah, white players are better than black players. No, they're not. They just get more backing, belief, and opportunities than black players, their black counterparts do, simply because the coach, kind of like feels like they're likelier to succeed. And so they do that all the time. And that's how we end up with the situation. I mean, I know I'm taking too long now to answer the same question, but I don't know if you remember a guy called Foppe de Haan from Ajax Cape Town,
Yes.
a Dutch
Ajax,
coach
yeah.
from Ajax Cape Town. So Foppe coached Ajax Cape Town to second in one of the PSL title chases behind Pirates, I think it was. And one of his star players, Tulane Serero, was then taken on by Ajax Amsterdam.
Ajax
And
Amsterdam, yeah.
and then so Foppe had gone back to Holland, to Heerenveen, I think it was. And so the Dutch media flocked to him to ask him, what can you tell us about this guy? And the interesting thing that Foppe said there for me was, if you go back to where this guy comes from in Soweto, you'll see that he comes from a two-roomed house and whatnot. He basically outlined Serero's, humble beginnings or modest beginnings. And it then hit me that you had a guy who was stationed in Cape Town, glorious Cape Town, didn't have to leave Cape Town. He hopped on a 2-hour flight to come to Joburg so he can go to Soweto, a place most people don't willingly want to go to, even us people in the suburbs in Joburg. And he went to see where his star player was from so that he could understand him a bit better. I'm not advocating for everyone to hop on a plane every time they got a black player in front of them, but I am saying it's your job as a coach to get to know the guy so that you know how to get the best out of him. I don't think enough of our coaches do that. It's that simple.
Yeah, you said something there that really resonated, that sometimes transformation is not blocked by racism. Sometimes it's literally blocked by the ability
Convenient.
to open up the convenience. And it immediately made me think of Laurie Maines when Laurie Maines coached the Cats. Really good coach. But I remember Conrad Yankees struggling to get into that team, and Conrad was super talented. Gobani Bob was super talented. These guys really battled to get into the team of a New Zealand coach who we thought, would have been exposed to Maori players, very talented players of color in New Zealand. And then you also earlier alluded to the Australians and the way they treated Indigenous players. And I remember Andrew Walker, the fullback, going on walkabout, where they go off into, you know, the wild goodness knows for how long. And it is a tradition. And he was expected as an Aboriginal male to do this. But Ravi just saw a space for him. I'm going to have to move on because I've actually been on with, with you for like an hour. And maybe I should
Talk
think about
long.
wrapping up. Yeah, man, yes, it's rugby. We can talk forever. But maybe just put a nice little ribbon on it because there are so many stories that we can think back on, especially tour stories, war stories. I was introduced to the world of rugby tours by JJ Adams and Brendan Null. I mean, I don't think I could have asked for two better ushers to take me to the Hong Kong Sevens for my first trip,
Yeah.
and sort of pull me into the world of journalism. And I just have this memory whenever I bump into you. I'm going to ask you if you have a favorite memory, but whenever I bump into you, I think we were in Wellington. We're at the Cape Town, and
Yeah.
walking towards the commentary booths or the media suite, and Laurie Mains sees these two dreadlock black guys before before a Springbok All Blacks test. I'm sure it was the Cape Town. And he comes up with this gruff voice like Murray does, and he says, "Oh, it's the Africans." And that was probably the first time I realized that this politics and this rugby thing and this South Africa and being in it versus out of it, it's a little bit more complex than what I've been made to believe. Do you look back and think, this is the one war story? This is the one war story.
Look, I've got so many. I'm Nah, I'll go to the beginning. My very first Springbok tour. It was with Harry Yoon in 2001. I think we were playing against France, England, and on the English leg, we we were in the hotel, and I'd written something that Harry hadn't liked, and we got stuck in the same lift, trying to go upstairs, and Harry just, he was under pressure, just offloaded on me about how I need to understand the game a bit better. I need to kind of like almost go back to the drawing board and understand the game a bit better, because as things stand, I don't know what I'm talking about, which is fair enough, you know. And I get to my room, I'm a youngster, all over the place. I've just been shut all over by a Springbok coach. And I phoned my old boss, which was Clinton van der Berg at the Sunday Times. And I say to him, Clint, I've just had Harry on my case, man. Yes, I said, he lost it completely. And he says, tell Harry that this time next year, you'll still be here and he won't. A month later, Harry had resigned. So
Oh, wow.
every time I fall out with the coach, I'm kind of like, yeah, one of us will still be here. It's probably not you. And I've told the
Yeah, no,
young,
no, no.
I've told the youngsters, look, just think of that. Obviously, don't say it. It's not a nice thing to say, but just think of that. We've got more longevity because, well, we don't play for starters.
Exactly. It's not a popularity contest either. It's just
No,
it's about
not a,
writing.
not a.
So we've touched on a number of subjects, and this is why you just have to come back, because one, I enjoy it, and two, there's so much to talk about. So we've spoken about so SA Rugby and losing out potentially on the future World Cups coming here. Uh, Rassie Erasmus had a comment to make a little earlier this week. I think it was just yesterday, and it was in reference to the injury to Steven Kitshoff and its links to the bomb squad. Um, I was very interested to see what Rassie had to say, and also that the world still seems to have an issue with the bomb squad. Is this a problem, Sim? Yay or nay?
Um, the only problem is the way what the rest of the world thinks of it. Look, the the bomb squad option is an option that anyone can use, as France have shown recently. And I think Franco Smith showed in one of Glasgow's games in the Champions Cup. So people are trying it because it's an option that's available to you. So you can't complain about an option that's available to you as if it's not available to you. That's been the problem for me. What Matt Williams said, kind of like insinuating that the way we sort of do live scrums in training has kind of contributed to Stephen Kitshoff's neck injury, which has forced him to retire. It's quite tasteless because essentially what he's doing there is he's trying to get his clicks and he's, and make his point by disingenuously using quite a serious situation. And that's where I kind of draw the line. We are officially in a ridiculous space where like people will say anything to make their points. The bomb squad has been approved by health officials. It has now been approved by World Rugby. And like I said, it's available to everyone. Use it rather than complain about it.
Yeah, it is available to everyone, and also I always think, why are we so short-sighted? Because this is just a change to tactics, and at some stage they will change again. Somebody will find another loophole and another way of scoring points or stopping the opposition or utilizing the scrum more effectively or the line out more, whatever, the set play more effectively as well. Rassie was also talking about the age of the current crop of Springboks, because there was that concern after the last World Cup. Are these guys getting too long in the tooth? Um, what's your take on it? I mean, I look at the conditioning of the older statesmen in that Springbok squad, and maybe start with someone like a Sia, someone like a Damien Dialander. These guys are in their 30s now. Magazole Mapimpi is probably the freak when you look at the age profile of the Springboks and just the level at which he's still playing, that he hasn't seemed to have lost a yard of pace. What do you make of the age profile of the Boks going into 2027?
I'll give you a simple number. Um, that one in 2023 will be 35 or more at the next World Cup. And I think only about and that's not including players who've retired. That's not including players like Dwayne Vermeulen and now Stephen Kitshoff. 15. That is an awful lot. It's great experience, but they are at that stage of their careers where, like, you have no idea what the next year brings. As in, they form, or they conditioning would fall off a cliff simply because there's a fine line between being battle hardened and battle weary. And that's where, unfortunately, those players are going to be. And you have to remember the kind of rugby they've played to be there, which is probably to be harder than the next guy, as in the opposition. I know that
Yes.
today's science is 10 times better than it used to be in the old days, but it is something that needs to be addressed. And the problem is, you've got freaks like Etzebeth who just, I mean, that guy cannot be human. And you got other freaks like, smaller freak like Cheslin Colby, who also can't be human when you see how he swats someone the size of Malcolm Marx, like from the side like he did last weekend. And then you've got, the ultimate animal, Peter Steph du Toit. So, I mean, yes, these guys are sort of freakish, once in a generation talent, but Father Time has never been bested in all this time. So we do need to get, to a point where we now officially fixing, sort of looking after after the depth. And if you look at last year, a big talking point from last year's international season, was that the Boks used 51 players. The whole point of using that
Yes.
many players was to make sure that was Rassie trying to squeeze as many tests into the younger players as he possibly can. Obviously looking forward to, looking ahead to, when these guys either retire off their own steam or have to get told, to retire, or can no longer do the job, or actually
Yeah.
some of them will be able to go through to that next World Cup. But, like, he's kind of covered himself by making sure that he picks as many, players as he possibly can. And then if you look at the alignment camp, the guys that are coming through, he's working around the clock from what you can see to try and make sure that, maybe the guys have got, I don't know, hopefully 20 to 30 caps, in them by the time they go to the next World Cup, if they're going to try and emulate, admittedly, once in a generation players.
I hate what you say about Father Time, because I know it's true. I hate what you say about falling off a cliff, because I know it's
Well,
true. And I'm looking at Rodri getting injured at Man City, and looking at Eoban not coming back from his injury on the Springboks, and I'm seeing parallels there. Maybe I shouldn't look at Rodri at Man City and compare and compare him to Eoban. But it is a relief to see that he's coming back from an injury. It is a worry. I was definitely thinking Patrick Lambie all over again. But it does also tell me that you're going to have to wrap this guy in a bit of cotton wool. You're going to have to manage him And if he is going to be around in 2027, he might not even be a starter. Maybe he's the guy who was part of the bomb squad, if the bomb squad still exists. Maybe he plays 60 minutes. And that's a bit of a concern, but at least some relief that he's back on the field and that it wasn't quite a Pat Lambie.
Look, it most definitely is, because head injuries are probably the biggest drawback of the game right now. When you hear someone like Sebastian Chabal saying he has no recollection of his rugby career, which was obviously glorious. I mean, I watched that guy at the 2007 World Cup. I was there. I was in interview rooms where he was. And, to watch a guy like that say he has no recollection, you have to be serious about how you address the head injury situation. I know a lot of people keep going, but the game's gone soft. No, why don't you try not remembering your kids simply because, you've taken too many knocks to the head? Nobody wants that. And because nobody wants that, we shouldn't want that for the players. And so it's good to see him back. Sure, the fact that he took so long to come back was cause for concern. But, looking on the other side of it, maybe that was a great thing that he took so long, simply because it means due sort of care was taken to make sure that he was ready to come back. And now he can do what he does. Going forward, it'll be interesting. I think he probably needs to put himself in cotton wool, not expect these bosses to put him in cotton wool. And the easiest way, from what I can see, is to take a contract in Japan, where he doesn't have to play in the URC and play in the Champions Cup, because those are really tough games and those are really long seasons. So to look after himself, if I were, advising the Boks, who will be 35 and over in 2027 at the World Cup, I would say take a contract in Japan, play less games, and be kinder to your body, and see how far that takes you. Also, you got to remember with the Boks, they missed that 1 year, the 2020. I've asked this question a million times before, where I said to Jacques Ninaba, I said, does this mean that they are 1 year younger in, physically, in terms of playing the game? And I must admit, Jacques looked at me with proper disdain, like, what is this guy talking about? This is why you shouldn't talk with journalists, because these folks don't know what they're talking about. He says, the only way you're going to get better at playing rugby is by playing rugby. I'm thinking, having watched them go through to 2023, it's not like they didn't get better at rugby. I mean, they played there with an evolved game, and now it's evolving with Tony Brown. So maybe I do have a point that they are 1 year younger collectively, because they didn't go to Australia to play, that COVID rugby championship. I know it's wishful thinking, but, allow a guy to dream.
You're allowed. You're allowed. You're allowed. You're allowed. I've got one last question here, and it's from our in-house rugby Julian, who asked the question, and it's a very good question, because he spoke about Sebastian Chabal, and I've got a story about him maybe at the end. There have been many former players, he says, from overseas have admitted to early onset dementia, especially in Wales, I think. And why have no SA players come forward? Which is a good question, Julian. And I think there is something about the macho-ness, the Calvinistic upbringing, the we don't cry, we just storm ahead mentality of South Africans. What's your take? Why haven't we heard the story? I mean, there was a lot of fear, I think, after US Photo Westhuizen. But then since then, I haven't heard much in terms of research, in terms of stats, in terms of testing, long-term or otherwise. Why do you think in South Africa we don't want to necessarily talk about it?
Yeah, I agree with you. It can't possibly be because our guys don't have the same issues. It comes down to exactly that. When you listen to rugby, when we all get misty-eyed watching, chasing the sun, one or two, and they're talking in the background about what kind of players they want. And when they say they want warriors, we all get, warmed to the core. And, we want to go breaking walls after that. Because, you've got to be a warrior to play for the Boks. And it's that approach that is resulting in guys sort of not coming forward when they could and should. And you've just getting onto a rugby field is an act in bravery. It's a bit like entering a UFC octagon or entering a boxing ring. It's an act in bravery just to be there. And so it takes a different kind of man who obviously, you know, doesn't run to the authorities when things get rough. But yeah, it is a problem simply because you know, these guys have families and we have a duty to, these guys have entertained us for so long. We have a duty to care about what happens with them afterwards. You don't want to meet these guys and they're like old boxers, slurring their words
Yeah.
and drooling out of the side of their mouth simply because the game didn't look after them. That's maybe another thing that South African rugby should sort of actively try and encourage, even if it's private. You don't necessarily, all you need is one or two guys to come out in public that will encourage other guys to come forward, even if it's in private. But it has to happen simply because, they can't be immune to what has happened to other players elsewhere. And if you think about it, you talk about Welsh players, one or two English guys, and you talk about Shabal. Maybe in the rest of of the free world, guys actually haven't reported it much either. So there's a lot of work to be done there in how the players see themselves. They need to start seeing themselves as human instead of just machines, because for so long the game has seen them as machines and treated them like machines. It does now need to kind of like find its human side and sort of reach out.
Yeah, and I've seen players just being physical if play professional rugby at the highest level for an extended period, and you can see the injuries, you can see the shuffle, you can see that this man is by the age of 50, 60, whatever it might be, have to be in a wheelchair. Have you encountered any former players and you thought, yeah, maybe the injuries, the head it knocks, have taken a toll, or maybe just suspected? And I mean, it's not for the sake of asking for you to name names, but have you come across or encountered any players where you thought, we need to take this seriously?
Um, Actually, not really. But like
Mm,
also sometimes when you talk to guys, you think, he was never the most articulate to start with, and so you think it's just a continuation of the same thing, which isn't it's not a dig at the players or at the ex players, but like I haven't seen that many guys. But my suspicion would also be like you would only see those guys if they came out in public. And so maybe a lot of
yeah,
those guys, once they start realizing that, hang on, wait, I've got these problems, they don't
that's the
kind of
way.
like come up and sort of put themselves in a situation where people are going to start asking questions like that. So I think that's essentially what it is. That would be the explanation for why I haven't seen that many sort of, ex players who look to be in strife.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think I have to wrap it. I've got so many more things that I wanted to talk about, but I've enjoyed this. It's been really cool, man. Like I hope that you're going to join us regularly, because there's a lot of things that I think in terms of opinion, I'd like you to share as well. And I know your writers are limited by what the editor needs and wants, so I hope that you use this as a way to get those thoughts out there. There's a lot of questions as well that I think we will get from our chat, and I appreciate all of you and the questions. Don't forget to give us a like, share, subscribe. And just before I let you go, Sebastian Chabal, 2007 Rugby World Cup. I was there in those press conferences with you, and the French had a home base, Makosi, the, the little town, sleepy little village of Makosi, probably, what is it, 30, 40 kilometers outside of Paris. Beautiful setting, and it was French HD and sort of forest, beautiful little, very quaint village, and then a massive training facility, which I think probably even shades the SAS, the SA Sports Institute in Stellenbosch. It was fantastic. We sat there through the press conferences, and they only spoke in French. They refused to speak in English.
I
Who was
remember
the who was
we all
you
took,
remember-
we
who
all
was
took that
the
trip just
who
so
was
he
the
could
team?
refuse to speak in English.
Yeah, who
He
was the
said,
team
you guys are
manager?
in France.
Joe Mas
You need to speak
Joe
French. I
Massot.
was just like, oh, yeah, exactly. And then, of
Yeah,
course, you
Joe
get
Massot.
terrible translation and you walk away from this guy who's captured the imagination of the world with these performances, and you've got practically nothing to write about. I remember that very well as well.
Yeah,
I was not
yeah.
impressed. And my boss wasn't either because, of course, he doesn't care. He's just sitting there like, well, Jesus, that's the best you
We
could
sent
get.
you.
Wow.
Yeah, we sent you guys. And I
Yeah,
stood there with
exactly.
with a camera over my shoulder, and we're in a huddle, and there's Sebastian Chabal, sort of slightly removed from us, and he's just fielding questions and answering in French, and I can't get a word in edgeways. And I think, okay, my strategy is I'm going to wait until the end, and I'm going to jump in with an English question. And there I jump in with an English question. I'm like, bonjour, Monsieur Chabal. Um, just one or two questions for you English speaking South African fans. And he had that stern look. He looked at me like this is no, this is France, only French. And then he goes, oui. And then he turned around and he walked off, and I thought, jeez, I've
Now I
spent the
remember
entire
that. I
day
remember
here,
that.
the whole day here to speak to this guy, and then he does me like that. Um, I did say we're wrapping up. I know that my man in the background, Paul, has got a couple of graphics and fixtures. Maybe we go through it very, very, very quickly. There's not too much to reflect on. Really, URC is what is coming back. So, Paulie, if you can hear me and if you've got those fixtures, I think URC is pretty much the big competition. Yes, there are Easter Schools festivals, and of course, the big one from last week was this, or from this past week rather, is Marty's going down at home to the Ikes in the Varsity Cup final. So well done to Flecky and his team, and we'll speak to him. Nice for Ikes. I think the team that I know you didn't watch much Varsity Cup and you weren't involved in it this year, but it's really good to see that it's changed hands. I love that. I want there to be sort of parity, and that's a good thing.
It was good to see Flecky sort of
Good.
coaching. The last time he coached was Stormers. That hadn't gone so well. It's nice. It's nice when you've got guys with that kind of experience, and they can give it back to these youngsters because the Varsity Cup in the absence of some of the junior structures in post school in South Africa has become a very important sort of cog in the whole machine that produces rugby talent. And so it's important for them to be used. What you spoke about, this opposition number being all Kabamba floors. It's important for those guys to be who play Boks and who play professionally to give back to the game at that level, because I've always said
Yeah,
one of the important things is that the coaches at the lower levels need to almost be better than the coaches at the higher levels, because you're doing
bingo.
less coaching at that level than you're talking strategy and whatnot, and sort of just the mentality side of the game. So when you've got those guys who can do that, it's always great. Marty's, I'm pretty sure they got it where they are, but they can't complain. They've won a lot of these things, including what,
Yeah,
4 in a row when
and
it
they will again.
started. Yeah, exactly. It's always nice when a slightly smaller team, because you can't exactly say UCT are one of the smaller teams in the competition, but a slightly smaller team, gets the result every now and again. So always good to see, always good to see progression. Always good to see old faces. Like I was
Yeah,
very happy for Flecky because he helped me out last year. I did a story on Ibn Etzebeth, and he'd coached him
yeah.
at the Stormers, and he helped me
Stormers,
out. He
yeah.
gave me like a half an hour long interview that I could use in the build up to that record breaking cap at Nelspruit. So it was good to see him succeed as well.
Yeah, no, he's a good man, and he's a good man for a night on the town, but let's not go there. URC, this is what's coming up this weekend. There is no European Cup rugby. And yeah, just very quickly, it is the Vodacom Bulls who find themselves in third, Sharks fourth. Everybody wants a top 8 place. That's what we're gunning for. And as you can see, the Lions in 13th have more work to do than the other South African teams. And the Sharks are up against an Edinburgh that is looking very good. Sean Everett left under, I think, a bit of a cloud from the Bulls. It didn't last at the Sharks either. Now at Edinburgh, he's starting to rack up wins against the South African side. So he'll be very happy and will want to maintain that. The Lions up against Benetton, they'll be very disappointed because the Lions have this thing of showing glimpses of brilliance, and they really have over the last 2 seasons. But then the results just don't sustain themselves. Stormers up against Connaught. Connaught have just lost their head coach. He resigned before they came out to South Africa, and they've got a 2-match tour in SA. And then, of course, Munster Bulls. It's an absolute massive one at Thomond Park, with the Vodacom Bulls needing to bounce back. They shouldn't have lost like they did in their last outing. They certainly are a better team than what they've shown. But very quickly, to me, looks like Bulls Sharks in a lot of work for the Lions. I don't see them clawing back with just 4 rounds left, and the Stormers probably should.
Yeah. So it's obviously the final sort of straight in terms of the league games. There's 4 more league games left, and Bulls got a bit of a problem on their hands because they got Munster, who upset La Rochelle in the Champions Cup, and then they've got Glasgow after that, who beat them, at Loftus in the final last year. So Bulls have got their work cut out for the remainder of their tour, but they should actually still, at the very least, if they don't beat Glasgow, they should at the very least maintain their third place. If they do beat Glasgow, suddenly they've got an opportunity to actually finish second, because Glasgow still has Leinster, who beat them 52-0 this past weekend. So, a lot going on in that sense. The Sharks, you've got to feel for Edinburgh. This is the third South African team in successive weekends
In a
that they're
row.
playing. So the boys must be feeling a bit now, because our guys are always physical. And the Sharks have actually picked their best possible team with something like 12 boxes in the starting lineup, and they picked every possible guy. So it's going to be a very difficult afternoon for Edinburgh. I will be very impressed if they win that match. But in terms of who may or may not make it into the last 8, I imagine the Stormers will be, the third and final team from South Africa to do that, simply because they've got the kind of sort of run in of all the teams. They got Connaught this weekend, but it's at home. They've got Benetton, but
Yeah.
it's also at home. And then they've got the
At home,
Dragons
yeah.
do a last, and then I forget what the very last game is that they have. So they probably got a nice
Yeah.
run. What you really need to look out for, though,
Isn't it the
is
Scarlets?
if the Bulls finish third, they could find themselves playing a quarterfinal against each other, especially if the Stormers finish around
Oh.
6th. So you could have a showdown, sort of a north-south derby in the quarterfinal at Loftus between the Bulls and the Stormers. That would be exactly what the Bulls do not want to happen, because I think the Stormers are coming into their own. They've got Sasha back. They've got Damian Willemse back. Boogie's been doing his thing. Mani might come back. And if you look at those guys coming back, there might be some big issues for the Bulls in that last 8.
Yeah, no, that's it is a good run in, I think, for the guys who are at home. I think the Lions have also got a nice home run, and they'll want to finish on a high. There's a question that I've got in my mind, which I'm not going to do now. I'll save for the next time we're on, about Sanele Nohamba, who probably shouldn't have hambered from SA, and I wonder if it's to do with missing out.
The name literally says no Hamba, and they let him
Nohamba,
go.
and the guy is gone.
And they let him go.
They let him go. And anyway, I've kept you for an hour and a half, and I think I said to you half an hour. So I want to maintain the friendship. I want you back on. Sim, thank you so much for your time, bro. It's there's a lot to talk about, and I'm only glad to be able to talk about it with you.
Well, we did threaten a drink, and like Joburg people, we didn't meet for it. So maybe this makes up for that.
Yeah, next time I'm gonna come in here with a bottle of wine, not even a glass, just in case we don't actually. I think Melville is it. Melville it is. Melville it is. We'll catch up there. Sydney, thanks again, and for you at home, thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to give us a like, a share, a subscribe. I'm Gola, that's and this is That Rugby Union Show. Cheers.